Hello and welcome to this week's Patrons Only video on, and I've decided to focus on Barnabas, this great guy that we hear of in the book of Acts and in 1 Corinthians and Galatians. He's mentioned once in Colossians. One of the unsung heroes, I would say, of the early church. I like this guy. So who is this Barnabas? Well, of course, we do. We learn the most about Barnabas from the book of Acts. In just these two verses that we did this week, 4:36 and 37, we find out that he's a native of Cyprus. And the reason, of course, this is significant is because when Paul and Barnabas and John Mark go on the first missionary journey, where do they go? They go to Cyprus. And this makes sense, right? Start with the territory you know. Paul does this arguably when Paul goes home to Tarsus. And he's in Tarsus for like 8 years, it seems. And what's he doing there? Well, I assume that he's spreading the gospel in those parts of Eastern Asia Minor that Acts doesn't mention later on. I can't see Paul staying in Tarsus for 8 years, frankly. In my mind, I think he could have gone up to Cappadocia. You know, who knows where all they might have gone. But by the time he and Barnabas go to Asia Minor on the first missionary journey, it seems like he's already covered, that eastern part. And now he's ready to move toward the middle a little bit with Barnabas. So Barnabas is a native of Cyprus, so it makes sense that they would go to Cyprus first. Of course, he's Jew. He's a diaspora Jew, a Greek-speaking Jew. He's a Levite. This is interesting. A Levite. He's of priestly descent. This is very interesting to me, that you would have a Levite living on the island of Cyprus. His name is actually Joseph. Barnabas seems to be a name that was conferred upon him by the apostles. Barnabas is said to mean son of encouragement. And so apparently Barnabas had the gift of mediation. He had the gift of calming things down, the gift of making people feel good. So when I think about, the various roles that people have in the church, so take pastors. Some pastors are clearly preachers. I would say Steve Deneff, my pastor, is a preacher. I mean, that's the heart of who he is. There are some pastors who are administrators, and they haven't always gotten the most favor in the past or the appreciation that they need. But in this day and age where we have executive pastors, I think of somebody like Dan Ryland. 12 Stone would not be where it is if Dan Ryland wasn't there, in my opinion. So here's an example of an administrative pastor. Then there's another kind of pastor. This is the pastoral counselor. This is the person that you love to come visit you, the person who loves to go in the hospital, the person who was drawn to CPE in seminary. This person is the kind of person I see a Barnabas. This is like a Judy Huffman, if you know, or Judy Crossman now, if you know her. Of course, I'm giving Wesleyan examples. But so Barnabas is an encouraging guy. When you're down in the dumps, Barnabas is the guy to lift you up. Now, again, I'm reading some things into this. It doesn't say these things. But this is kind of the way I picture Barnabas. So he is an example of someone. He's a selfless guy. He has some extra property, and there are people in need. He sells it. Of course, they all probably think Jesus is coming back, tomorrow. And so one of the problem with apocalyptic communities, there was a group called the Holy Jumpers that was initially up in Chicago, and then they went up into Wisconsin. They thought the Lord was coming back almost immediately. And so to join their community, you had to sell all your possessions and throw it into the common pot. Well, it might actually have made a go of it if some of its leaders had kept the hotels they owed. Very soon, the shift of this community changed from evangelism to trying to get people about to die to donate their property. That's a tangent. But certainly, Barnabas shows the right attitude when he sells his possessions to give to the community. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll have other things to look at, I assume, when we get to those later chapters of Acts. When Saul, who we know of as Paul, when he comes to Christ, we know from Galatians that he spends about 3 years up in that area of Syria, goes into Arab country even. Paul calls it Arabia. It's not Saudi Arabia, though. It's the Nabatean kingdom that's just just to the east of the Roman Empire, very close to Damascus, actually. Damascus is near the border of where the Roman Empire ends and the Nabatean kingdom began. And so Paul spends about 3 years after he comes to Christ probably trying to sort some stuff out. I mean, he was going completely one direction, and then God taps him on the shoulder, and now he's going completely another direction. It's going to take a little time to sort this out. We'll get to these things, of course. But when Paul finally does go to Jerusalem, let's just say that Peter and those guys they're not real keen on meeting this Saul guy. He's still being called Saul, by the way. Saul is called Saul for about 10 years after he becomes a Christian in the book of Acts. It is Barnabas who brings Saul to Peter. Again, this is the guy. This is the guy who he's not afraid. Peter's afraid, apparently. Barnabas isn't afraid. So he maybe he's a quiet guy. Maybe he's not the upfront guy, but he's the guy that has the courage and the faith to go get Saul and bring him to Peter and say, look, he's not going to kill you. You're not going to kill him, are you, Saul? No, I'm not going to kill you. He's not going to kill you. Anyway, like that movie scene in Red. Okay, so Barnabas, great guy. Now, when the church at Antioch really seems to get going, and this is the most missional church in the earliest days of Christianity is the church at Antioch, and they're priming up for mission. And what occurs to Barnabas? Now we don't know the details of how this happened. Maybe the church at Antioch said, we want Barnabas to come help us, or Saul to come help us. Maybe it was just Barnabas' idea. Barnabas thought, man, Saul's got skills, and he's out there all by his lonesome. It's time to bring him into the fold. So Barnabas is a mentor. Barnabas sees a guy with potential, and or could have been a gal, but Saul's not a gal. Barnabas goes, gets him, brings him back to Antioch, and integrates him into the mission. Barnabas and Saul go down to Jerusalem with the gift trip. This is where there's a famine down in Jerusalem, and the Lord has, through Agabus the prophet, told them that this is going to happen. They apparently have prepared, and so Barnabas and Saul go down to Jerusalem with this gift, and of course bring John Mark, who is, we learn from Colossians, is Barnabas's cousin. Bring him back from Jerusalem to Antioch, which sets us up for the first missionary journey, the first missionary journey starts out in Cyprus with Barnabas and John Mark and Saul. It is when they are on the island of Cyprus that Saul starts going by what arguably is his Roman name, Paul, probably a name he's had all along. So Paul is probably, it's not that he suddenly gets this name. It's not his Christian name, to be sure. It's just a name that to him represents his Roman identity. He's a Roman citizen. Paul represents his being a Roman citizen. Paul being a Pharisee for so long, he's not proud of being a Roman citizen. This is not something he highlights. In fact, it sure seems like in the book of Acts that he'd rather be beaten a little bit, than admit to being a Roman citizen. Of course, he gets over it. At Philippi, he decides, you know what, I can use this Roman citizen thing for the betterment of the gospel. And he stops hiding it, starts using it. But Barnabas goes, and it seems like Barnabas is in charge. It's interesting at Lystra. The people think, by the way, there's a story, when we get there, we'll talk about it, a pagan story about Zeus and Hermes coming down to Phrygia and pretending to be people, and the people of Phrygia not welcoming them. So when we get to that, we'll talk about it. But the people of Lystra aren't going to make the same mistake again. And so they call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes. Now, Hermes is the speaker, but Zeus is in charge. So it's interesting. The implication here is that Barnabas is the guy in charge of the mission. Paul just talks a lot. Anyway, so that says something. Barnabas is a person who, it would seem, Barnabas is a leader who can let people with stronger personalities, and I would say people with stronger gifts, people with stronger knowledge in some respects, that Barnabas is not intimidated by Paul. Barnabas is the leader of this trip, but Barnabas can let Paul be in the foreground and to do his thing. This is a great leader in that respect. By the way, John Mark seems to be ticked off by this. Now, we don't know all the reasons why John Mark goes home and John Mark doesn't complete the mission, but here are some of my thoughts on why John Mark might have done this. One, John Mark might be thinking, hey, I only thought we were going to Cyprus. Nobody said anything about us going up to Asia Minor. Have you seen these mountains? And they're going to have me carry stuff. I mean, this Paul guy's not easy to, this guy's a bossy guy. He's not easy to work with. I mean, these are things that John Mark could have been thinking. That's one. Another one is, why is Paul taking the lead on this trip? I thought that my cuz was in charge of this trip. So that's another. And then a third one might be is, we're Jews. Why is Paul talking to so many Gentiles? Paul seems to think that our main mission is to the Gentiles. Our main mission is to the Jews. And so John Mark goes home. We get the impression sometimes that it's just that John Mark was a quitter. And maybe he was a quitter. That message will preach too. But I wonder if there's more going on there that meets the eye. I'm getting a little ahead of myself because we'll get to this stuff later on. But some of the most juicy stuff on Barnabas has to do with Acts 15 and Acts 2. Now, there are different opinions. Some think that Galatians 2 gives us a more private meetings before Acts 15 and that Acts 15 resolved everything. We'll get to this eventually in Acts. I actually think that to a large extent, these are two perspectives on the same basic event. You don't have to agree with that. So initially, Paul and Barnabas meet with James and Peter. This is a smart thing, and I'll talk about this later on. Get the leaders on your side before there's a public conflict. That's smart. If you have the smarts to realize that the conflict's coming, meet with the leaders to make sure they understand what's going on before. You don't want people to encounter an important concept in the heat of the moment, because then you can't think straight. You don't want to have the argument in the parking lot over whether or not the church should be involved in politics or not. A sticky church reference. You want to talk about the church's engagement with politics before you actually have a flashpoint. And so this is really smart. Paul and Barnabas, they go down, they meet with James and Peter before everything blows up and kind of get them on their side. They take Titus with them. This is brilliant. What are you going to say? Titus is going to hell? Pray for them, Titus. Titus isn't going to hell. Titus is a believer, and he's not circumcised. I'm joking. Paul actually never mentions the word hell in any of his writings. But anyway, Barnabas again is the glue of this thing. Everything gets reconciled when Barnabas is around, or at least he tries. And so they have this kind of meeting in Galatians 2. But and of course in Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas support the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised to be saved position, which is the position that James comes down on when he makes his decision. James, the Lord's brother. Now, here's where Paul and Barnabas have a disagreement. After that initial meeting with James and Peter at Antioch, there's a dispute. It's not over whether Gentiles need to be circumcised. It's about whether Jewish and Gentile Christians can eat together. And the purity laws are what's in the back of this. So for James, there's a need for Jewish Christians to maintain their purity, which means that that meat has to be only certain kinds of meat can be eaten. So James is of the conviction that you need to, and this is my read, James is of the conviction you need to know whether or not the meat you're eating has been sacrificed to an idol. If the meat has been sacrificed to an idol, it is inherently defiled and must be avoided. This is James's position. Paul's position is more don't ask, don't tell, as we'll find out at Corinth. Paul basically says, eat the meat you buy in the marketplace without asking where it's come from. James doesn't agree. James believes you need to know for sure that the meat is not inherently defiled. For Paul, no food is unclean in of itself. If you think it's unclean, it's unclean. In Romans 14. Okay, so there's that issue. There's the issue of how the meat is prepared. If the meat is strangled, then the blood stays in the meat. And that makes you eat blood, which is, again, makes you impure as a Jew. So there are these purity concerns that James has about Jewish and Gentile believers eating together. I suspect he's prejudiced. He's got a little racism there. He thinks, oh, these Gentiles are bound to be unclean. And so we've got to be really careful as Jews. Be careful around Gentile believers. I know they're believers. They're not going to hell, but they're inferior. They're separate. So we have a separate but unequal policy here that James is advocating. I don't think Peter really cares. He's a fisherman, he's from Galilee. Of course, James is from Galilee too. But Peter eats with them. And then people come from James and tell him, Peter, what are you doing? You got to set the tone here. And Peter withdraws himself. We'll talk about all this when we get to Acts 15. And so Paul basically thinks this is hypocrisy. Man, I was a Pharisee. You guys you're not keeping the law at all. Unity is more important than the finer points of purity. And so we have this conflict at Antioch where Peter and James advocate withdrawal from the Gentile believers. And Paul says, no, we need to be unified. My position is now Paul says that Barnabas sides with Peter. But I'm guessing, this is what my guess. My guess is that it's not that Barnabas necessarily disagrees with Peter. It's that Barnabas believes that we need to keep the peace for now. We need to submit to the authority of Peter and James for now, and then we'll work it out. And they do, I think, work out a compromise. I think the end of Acts 15 is probably the compromise, that as long as Gentiles will not be sexually immoral, because you know how Gentiles are, not be sexually immoral, not make sure that the meat hasn't been offered to an idol, make sure that there's no blood in the meat, and the meat was not killed by strangling, but that the animal's blood was drained before cooking. And then Jewish and Gentile believer will be able to eat together. That seems to be what happens at the end of this whole process. So Barnabas's role here seems to be, again, what we would expect, this conciliatory role. Paul, just hold your horses, Paul. We're going to work this out. Just don't talk, Paul. Just be quiet for now, and we'll work it out. And of course, Paul can't do that. You hypocrite, Peter. I've kept the law. You've never kept the law. This is a joke, But again, what is Barnabas's character? Barnabas's character is the conciliatory, encouraging, mediator type person. And so Acts doesn't really tell us all this. This, by the way, tells us a little bit about the tendency of Acts. Acts highlights the unity. Acts is the ideal picture of the church. We don't see all of the warts in the book of Acts. We get these warts from Paul. And so when we find Paul and Barnabas disagreeing on whether to take John Mark on the second missionary journey, I don't think it's just about John Mark. I think there's a whole lot of deeper things going on here, including some disagreement on how the ministry should be conducted with regard to the Gentiles. And of course, God uses it for good. This disagreement, as we'll talk about, was a great boon to the church. Well, that's enough about John Mark. Enough about Barnabas. And I'm going to start the new format this week where daily I do a podcast in English. I will put the kind of the visual of it with the Greek on YouTube, with perhaps a little bit longer version of it on YouTube with the parsings and things. But we'll see how it works out. And you tell me, you're the ones who are involved here. By the way, Paul does mention Barnabas favorably in 1 Corinthians 9:6. So they stay friends. And of course, Colossians speaks positively about John Mark too in chapter 4. Have a great day.